Now I'm going to share order of operations, very important. Okay, so thanks everybody for bearing with me. I'm actually going to start with the Fulbright website because I think it's really helpful in terms of identifying programs and leading to non-Oxbridge universities. So the first thing to sort of run through again, and some of you have already heard this, that basically Fulbright does not fund Oxford or Cambridge, and with good reason, because there are other funding mechanisms for Oxford and Cambridge. So roughly at Oxford, you have the Rhodes, which is any subject. You have the Clarendon, which is actually more money, any subject chosen from across the university. And then there's something called the Erdogan, which is in the humanities expressly. And there are others, but those three, in addition to the Marshall Scholarship, which funds throughout the UK, including Oxford. At Cambridge, you have the Marshall again, the Gates Cambridge Scholarship, the Churchill in STEM fields exclusively, and then some additional things such as the Overseas Trust or St. James College has full bursaries. There are other things through the individual constituent colleges, and that is one of the specialties of Oxford and Cambridge, is that their college system where you actually live is the closest facsimile at Northwestern are the res colleges, but it's that sort of on steroids. It's where all the undergraduate teaching happens. It is where the undergraduates actually live in those buildings, as well as taking classes and being involved in their sports and extracurriculars there. It means that there are sort of exponential extracurricular opportunities because everything is done at each of the colleges. There are places like Durham and St. Andrews and the various other institutions that have smaller forms of that, and we can talk about that a bit later. But I wanted to start out, Fulbright's not going to cover those, but I know at least two of you are interested in universities that have partnership Fulbright. So I wanted to talk a bit about those and how you can use this Fulbright list to also think about places you might want to apply for a Marshall Scholarship to study at. And with the Marshall Scholarship, you have to have two plans. So a 2-year plan and a 2-year backup plan, which can end up meaning up to 4 master's degrees that you've identified with which you would be satisfied. So we have University of Manchester down here on the Fulbright, which is a nice little case study because it brags on being a Russell group. So if you guys are looking at grad school, you may have heard faculty talk about a Research 1 institution in the US. So Northwestern's a Research 1. The University of Illinois is a Research 1. Bowdoin College in Maine or Carleton College in Minnesota are great schools, but they aren't Research 1 universities, they're liberal arts colleges, right? So a Russell group is basically saying they have international caliber, they are a research intensive university. So that's one marker when you're looking at UK universities that you might not have heard of before. The other thing to be aware of is every university through the Fulbright partnerships can say what type of field they're interested in funding. So at Manchester, they won't let you do an MBA. They're saying that right up front, but they're open in other fields. If I go back and we look at the go through, so here it's Queen's University Belfast. So this one I actually checked because for folks who are interested in religion and theology, they might be very interested in, so basically Mara, might be interested in Queen's University Belfast, but with the Fulbright, they are saying they want you to apply to do global security and borders in this particular award. On the other hand, if you look more deeply into it, you realize, and this is another trademark of UK degrees, it's actually quite interdisciplinary. So Mara, you said you were interested in history and anthropology. Theology is not that far afield from philosophy in certain questions and approaches. So what might at first put you off makes it actually worth digging in a little bit deeper. And so that is the other thing you want to be wary of in looking at UK degrees in particular, is disciplines are sometimes named differently than they would be in the US. So material science is an example. We had a material scientist we've had two material scientists actually who have gone to Cambridge and done degrees that were housed within the physics department while they were at Cambridge. They were still doing material science in the terms, they were pursuing the same questions they'd been interested in undergraduates, but the faculty member happened to be in a different department. So when I was mentioning other places that have sort of collegiate system, Durham is like that. We had someone who was in Durham. Well, actually, we've had a couple of Northwestern folks who've been at Durham. And it is in a small town on the top of a hill with a big castle and a cathedral near Hadrian's Wall. It is a very well-known ancient institution within the UK, but not as necessarily as well known on the US market. But as you will see, that it has a residential collegiate system with long traditions. Our Marshall Scholar who was there was very involved in his MCR. We actually have someone who won. They are one of the UK universities that run elite sports scholarships for master's degrees, and we have someone who was a varsity fencer here who then went to fence there. She too has had an absolutely fabulous experience and been very involved with the sort of collegiate life within Durham. The other reason I do mention it, and you'll see here, Durham St. Cuthbert English Christianity, the first person I ever met who'd been at Durham was actually someone who was there in the divinity school. They have a well-known divinity school too. So this is where you can use the Fulbright as a pathway to checking out other institutions. So University College London, for example, has the Institute for Education. We were talking about Institute for Education, and here we go. The US Fulbright program has it partnered with the Institute for Education per se. We actually had someone who received this award several years ago, had a fabulous time. The previous director of the Searle Center was at Northwestern. How many of you who are actually in the call now have sort of heard of, I'm not sure, I don't think I can bring back the full screen to see, but James, for some reason they're showing me you. Can you nod? Have everybody heard of the Searle Center, or at least have you? Okay, so that's to give you a sort of flavor for the type of research they do. It's similar. In some cases it's similar, but they do host a bunch of master's degrees as well. The backfill that you can do then is, let's say you are looking at the Fulbright list and you go to, back on United Kingdom, and you see the Global Wales Postgraduate Award, and let's see if they list all the universities. And yes, so this is my favorite touch point. They list all the universities in Wales, and you say, what on earth is, and I can tell you, it's pronounced Aberystwyth. which is a beautiful university on the coast of Wales. It is the oldest university in Wales, and has a very strong reputation in many fields, but very few Americans have heard of it. So what you can then do is go to our friend, the REF. Now, unfortunately, due to COVID, Brexit, etc., the REF was supposed to be renewed very soon. The last time they did this full assessment was 2014. And it was to be coming up, but it hasn't been refreshed yet. So as with all rankings, you're taking this with a grain of salt, but that's where, if you're cross-checking it with what Fulbright is saying, and even better with campus mentors, you can then come and look here at the institution or the unit of assessment. So I'm going.
I think you have to share your other screen.
Oh, thank you. Now can you see REF 2014? Thank you. Okay, so I'm in the units of assessment on the REF website, and Paul said he was interested in epidemiology and public health. So one of the things you want to look at when we talk about differences in programs, for example, is how mathematical a public health program is. Whether it really is hardcore numeric epidemiology, whether it's in other, but here's public health. So if you're wanting to look through and see who has a strong record in public health and in any field, 4-star is the highest ranking of international caliber peer-reviewed research, basically. So the higher the number in the 4-star column, the better. And we go immediately to Bristol, which is, again, may or may not be known to most Americans, but again, within the UK is a well-known research university, and you're at 50% for public health. It has a large med school tied with Cambridge. And here's Imperial College London, which beats both of them with 57. And so Imperial College London is, to make a very rough equivalent, a kind of MIT of the UK, very strong science institution in London proper, and might well be the perfect place for someone to go in that field. And then we also have the usual suspect of Oxford. So that is where this ranking as a rough metric can be useful when you're cross-checking opportunities. But you do.
Can you put that link in the chat? I was trying to Google it and I couldn't find that website.
Oh, absolutely. So this is already in results. Just a minute. And that
Great, thank you.
is straight to the public health one.
Perfect.
Okay, now is where you're going to have to bear with me again, because in order to get the chat, I had to pause the screen sharing. It may be faster for me to just get out entirely. Okay, so we're back. Then let's go back and look at, so here's theology and religious studies. I always find this interesting whether or not this, so I like it when it confirms that my information is not horribly outdated. So Durham still there at the 50% mark. And I just want to see who else they have listed, because sometimes you will find it is not the institutions that are but right. So Birmingham, Durham, and both far outstrip Oxford and Cambridge in that arena, which I find interesting. And part of that is, just as a sidebar, at Oxford and Cambridge, there are theological colleges that are separate from the rest of the university, and they tend to be more like a straight up divinity school, where you are going to become an Anglican minister or an Anglican priest or a Catholic priest. So then, because we have this can be the interesting thing for material science, is this one where you actually get metallurgy, material science back in, not in so much my generation as my father's. It was a specialization in metallurgy. If you go through some, like I think at the U of I, they still listed among their material science listings. So whether or not fields like that, you're going to need to be careful to look at the particular faculty, and when you're fortunate and you have mentors who can help you suss that out, that makes it much easier. But here we have Oxford, Cambridge, and I'm just curious where Manchester comes in. And they break it out between metallurgy and materials and electrical engineering, because that's where I would want to be careful, is the lumping is so different. So all of this is fine and well. There is one other program that I want to show you before we talk more about the application process itself, though certainly ask questions if I am flipping over something. So this is the Erasmus Mundus catalog. So the Erasmus Mundus, and I will pick.
I don't think we can see this screen.
Okay, thank you. Now, did it take?
Yeah.
Okay. So the Erasmus Mundus is funded by the EU. At this point, they still have UK universities built in. It's 2 years. You do a thesis in the second year, and the whole idea is that you spend time at 2 to 3 different universities. Now, I mention it because for some people, it is absolutely perfect. As I always tell folks, you could look through, there are well over 100 of these master's degrees. There might not be any that appeal to you. On the other hand, there are folks for whom it is the absolute perfect match. They are highly interdisciplinary, but quite narrow. And when they're right, I have had folks absolutely euphoric because they never thought they'd find a degree in just that area. I bring it up today in part because for some people it is the perfect degree program. We have someone who's going over in like Neurasmus, they call it. It is a specialized neuroscience master's degree. It's the second person we've had who's done that program. The first one did indeed go on to an MD PhD. The other reason they're interesting is because it lets you know where in Europe that specialty exists, including sometimes in the UK. So if you find a program that appeals to you, this is in my next life, the International Master on Wine Tourism is a favorite of mine. You can look back at programs. It might take you back to programs in the UK if you really have your heart set in the UK or other places in Europe that you could think about doing a Fulbright. It's in Germany, a DAAD. It helps to expand what your options are. And I wanted to find there's a higher ed one, so I wanted to pull that one up because it sounded as if that might be of interest to Caroline. So this is where they work with networks of universities. They are not transparent applications, and very frequently, including our scholar this year, a lot of the application actually got set up, got entered sitting in my office so that I could sort of translate what they were asking for in the various boxes. If we are still working remotely, which I would hope not, because these have later deadlines and most of the things we're talking about today, we'd just do a dual Zoom session or something and I'd have you share screens so that I could tell you what stuff meant. But this is what I'm talking about. So you can see that they spend time at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 universities. Sometimes they're even universities outside the EU. And it's a form of vetting, just like the partnership with the UK Fulbright is. You may not have heard of it, but if it's made its way into the agreement with the EU, there's been quality control involved. Now, at this point, I'm going to stop sharing screens so that we can just talk more about the nitty-gritty, because part of what's going on here is figuring out who you would want your mentors to be. So each of these programs rewards folks who have identified intellectual mentors in country. Each application handles it differently, and some of you I know have already heard me talk about this in other contexts, but just to run through it again. With the Fulbright, even if you're doing a top master's degree, you want to secure a letter of affiliation. And so finding the partnership program, talking to your mentors here, and then reading papers written, books, whatever, by that person so that you can make outreach to them in a concrete way, saying, I'm interested in problem X, whether problem X is a humanistic or a numerically formed problem, and I've seen your work and I'm interested in writing my master's thesis with you or having you mentor me while I'm on the program. The thing that you have to be careful of is none of these folks can offer you admission, and they know that. So it's important to frame it as, if this works out, would you be able to mentor? And if that's the case, then get the letter of affiliation for Fulbright. Now, with the awards that require, the Fulbright has a campus endorsement process, but the premise of that is that everyone goes forward. It's that they're going forward with an opportunity to get feedback and review. There are people who self-sabotage and do not go forward, because I've literally had people submit campus applications that were blank, and we take that as a message that they're really not that interested. But if you want this to happen, then we're going to make it possible for you to go forward. With the Marshall, the Mitchell, which is both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and the Rhodes, then there is a campus process and there's no guarantee of going forward. However, the stronger your argument, the more likely you're A, going to get campus nomination, and B, draw an interview at the national level. And that is how deeply couched you are in the rationale of why you want to work with people at those particular universities. So you do not need a letter for those. With the Marshall, you do have to write a proposal, not a full-blown proposal, but a very brief academic argument in the application. With the Rhodes and the Mitchell, there isn't a set-aside piece for that. And with those essays, we're not allowed to give you feedback, but both the Rhodes and the Mitchell offer their own wisdom, largely presented by video, on their websites. And whether or not the single essay that seems most evocative for your logic includes academic specifics, I can assure you, if you end up in a room with the campus committee, being confident in with whom you'd like to work and why, is going to be a benefit. I should say, James, since you graduated at the end of fall quarter, you said?
That's right.
So as an alum, you do not have to get a nomination for the Mitchell. You can apply directly. So you only need to go through the nomination process if you are an enrolled undergraduate. So Caroline, if you found a program that you really liked in Ireland, for example, the same thing would hold for you because you're a master's student now. You do not need to go through the nomination process for Mitchell, but anyone is expected to be nominated by their undergraduate institution for Marshall and Rhodes, even if they graduated, and depending on the award, it's 2 to 3 years. You've got a 2 to 3 year window to apply. Now to flip to 3 others, the Churchill, the Gates, and the Clarendon at Oxford. So the Churchill is closest to Fulbright. So this is Churchill, Cambridge, and STEM. If you are doing a research degree, they want a letter from your research mentor. If you are doing one of the degree, a master's degree that is taught by their definition, which still would have a thesis at the end probably, but not always. Part 3 math, some of their trademark ones are more quantitative exam based. They don't require it. It's still going to be better to the extent that you have one if you're going into a mixed program as opposed to a straight up research degree. For the Gates to Cambridge, you are basically applying to grad school, and it's fairly short essays. But again, if you have engaged with a mentor who you've discussed what that looks like, your capacity to maximize those short essays and be very specific about, I look forward to doing seminars with Professor X and Y during the fall and the Michaelmas and Christmas term, and then during the Lent term, I would like to write my dissertation with Professor Muckety Muck. The more specific you are, the better you are. What happens when you say you're interested in external funding is then you get an additional Gates essay that comes up at the end. And again, it's shorter, it's only 500 words, and it's both your commitment to improve the lives of others, which is the Gates motto, as well as why the academic work should be done in Cambridge, why it makes most sense there. And the warning that I have to give with ever greater emphasis is they really want folks who'd like to stay for their PhD. So we just got the announcements for the full international list. We've known for a while that we have a Gates scholar. He's the one who's talking next week, who is going for his PhD. And I went through looking, and again, they announced that it was 80% PhD funding now, and it was interesting to go through our sort of peer institutions and see the shift now from where it was 10 years ago in terms of folks who are going for PhDs. But it underscored something that I've advised everyone for as long as I've been doing this. If you are thinking about a professional degree in the US, whether that's med school, law school, and any number, those 2 in particular, but it could be any number of other sort of professional qualifications in business or whatever. What you see is folks who have gotten those in the States who are going to get their PhD in Cambridge. So they're basically doing a streamlined MD PhD, a streamlined JD PhD. And I've worked with students over the years who've done all of those combinations, and you can do them where you go first and you do the PhD in the UK, and then you come back and you do your degree, or in some cases these folks have already gotten their professional degree in the UK and are now coming over, I mean in the US, I apologize, and then coming to the UK. Because the Gates allows that, there's no upper age limit, they're fine with that. It gives you that latitude. So with Gates, you want to think about that, and I would argue with Clarendon, you also want to consider that. With Clarendon, it's a direct application to Oxford. The more you know who you would like to mentor you, the better off you're going to be, because with both Clarendon and with Gates, the departments rank their admits and then forward their names for university-wide selection, roughly divided into 3: STEM, social science, and humanities arts. And the person who has the most enthusiastic supervisor to be is the most likely to have their name put forward for that full funding package. So those are the things I want folks to think about most, particularly at this stage. It's identifying the program and identifying the mentors, so that when you get to writing the essays, you've got all of that nailed down. And I wanted to show you the Irish universities as well today, but the Mitchell site is down for updating, so I couldn't do that. You can find many of them on the Irish Fulbright site, but once the Mitchell site has been refreshed, they provide direct links to all of the Irish universities as well. And as one final piece, if you go to our website and you look at external databases and links, we have an interactive UK map that if you just tick on these various universities and cities, if we know that they have specialized funding or internal funding at one of them, that will come up. So if you're thinking about what the full scope of funding opportunities might be somewhere, that can be useful. Okay, I have talked too much. Questions at this point?
Where's that map you're talking about? It's on the fellowship website?
Yes, let me see if I will pull that back up. Okay, so we're on our website, other databases. So certainly there are all sorts of things you might want to use here, but this is the UK interactive map that we've just put together. So you'll see Manchester has its own internal award for North American students, for example. Oh yeah, Belfast also has its own internal awards. In general, I tell folks, Scotland has, in post-COVID land, what has happened to universities' internal budgets is very much up for grab, but historically, the Scots universities have had good internal funding, and there's actually a special award, 2 special awards to go to Scotland, one by the Scots government, the Saltire, which is partial funding, and then the other is if you grew up within 250 miles of New York City, there is another special Scots foundation that funds grad study, but you have to be a senior to apply for that one. So this is some of the ones that we've identified here. And this is where I will say, in terms of timeline, the earlier you apply, the more likely you are to get those internal sources of funding. So for example, London School of Economics has the American Friends of LSE. Applying there, just the trick is not that you have to apply there before you've applied for other awards. Most of the fellowships have much earlier deadlines. It's just when you have filed fellowship applications, people get tired and then they don't file the direct application, and they're doing things like the American Friends of LSE on a rolling basis. So if you don't, you could apply in the spring. They might still admit you to the program, but the likelihood of your getting funding is very slim. So, you know, the ultimate deadlines are very late in Europe, but if you want that sort of internal funding, the motivation is to apply earlier in the cycle. So if we talk about calendar, first decision I tell everybody to make is think first about whether you're going to apply for Fulbright, because if you're going to apply for Fulbright, you definitely need a letter of affiliation. That's a longer set of engagements with the person there. And so the earlier you think about it, the better. And the earlier you start the conversation, the better. The next decision, which is if you seek nomination for Marshall and Rhodes, and Mitchell if you're still an undergrad, then I don't need everybody to have everything written and ready to go on August 15th, although you will find some of your friends at other institutions might be asked to do that. Some of them have had to be nominated already. What I want on August 15th is to make sure you've thought about your letter writers, and we can have individual conversations, you know, on that in terms of who you might want to ask. If you've got the British packet, that's got some advice in there. And if you don't, I can send it to you. So that I know who the letter writers are, so I can explain to them the multi-tiered process and the fact that no matter how much they want to talk to you about your Rhodes and Mitchell essay, they're not allowed to, etc. And I can set up the campus, and I can set up the campus interviews, but you don't actually have to have the essays to me until after Labor Day. Now, with what's going on in the world at the moment, if Northwestern's start date were to get moved around or something, and an attempt to accommodate, you know, moving in, none of that has been determined yet. But, you know, we have our deadline set currently, as we always do. And the truth is, we've always done a lot of these interviews by Skype anyhow. So, you know, from our perspective, this doesn't change the world that much. The only thing that might change it is if it turned out everybody was having to move back to campus on the day that we thought we were going to be doing interviews. That wouldn't be feasible, and so we would obviously adapt. But I don't see any urgent need to change the system because it's based around when those national deadlines are. I was just on a call with a bunch of the foundations yesterday. There was no, you know, discussion of changing the deadline. So I think we're on the standard schedule. Questions, concerns, website links that I didn't leave up long enough?
Just as like to go off the calendar. So like for right now, with sort of the best thing that we could be doing is just kind of reaching out, like making decisions on who we want to reach out to at these target institutions, and then going ahead and reaching out to them.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you said you'd already had your list. I assume you got that in conversation, you know, with your mentors. So, you know, one of the things is then, did the mentor say you can use my name when you reach out? And if they did, that's fabulous. That makes it easy. I still think it's always wise to make sure you've read something that the person has written so that you can frame your interests in conjunction with theirs when you reach out to them. I also advise if you're going to do the if you're emailing them, include your transcript. And if you've had if you are thinking in terms of a research project and you've already done a project or a paper that was on a related topic, attach that so that they get a sense, at least an abstract of it. You know, so that they get a sense of who you are intellectually, which helps them get started. the nice thing for the two of you in the sciences is that the mentors in the sciences, in my experience, are very used to talking to prospective grad students by Skype anyway. And so that seems to come quite naturally when our STEM students are looking at labs overseas that members of the Skype, and then you can talk to them about your interests and what group would look like and what they're working on. It is slightly less common in the humanities and social sciences, but it's not unheard of. And so if that's something that the person suggests or wants, go for it, because anytime you get to have a better sense of who the person is. The other thing is, I love to tell the story of a young woman who was a Gates finalist years ago. She was actually, her research was in epidemiology and virology, and she didn't ultimately get the Gates, but she had a lot of contact with the person with whom she wished to work, and he ended up getting her a fellowship at Clare College, Cambridge, that was like a one-off for people in their style of research, but she got treated like a fellow, which in the sort of arcane details of Oxford and Cambridge life, she got to sit up at high table with the faculty members for their events. She got a really posh deal for an award that nobody sitting in the US would ever have heard of, because that connection was there. And likewise, there was someone who did go over, it was another Gates finalist, who was someone who was an alum working on a master's degree at another US institute. No, working in a master's degree at Northwestern, was an alum of another institution and wanted to go to Cambridge for the PhD. Gates finalist, not selected, but again, had been in deep conversation with the mentor who got him a fellowship, or made him aware of a fellowship run by a civil engineering firm. I don't know whether you'd know it, Paul, Arup. I certainly never heard of it until this guy won it, and then it seemed to be everywhere. So not only did they fund his PhD, but part of the deal was they were doing a huge project in London. So every summer he worked on the huge project in London. They funded his PhD, and then they hired him upon completion. Again, never would have heard of it, but because he was having close conversations with the mentors in country, these things come through. And that's the other reason that I am a broken record on really investigating with whom you want to work and why, because my goal is to get you the opportunity. I am less concerned about who ultimately writes the check than that you have the opportunity. And the more people you know there, and the stronger the argument is, the more the more check signees make appearances. So that's now, Caroline, just because you were talking about higher ed and so forth, I also wanted to, it brings up for me one of the other distinctions between graduate programs sometimes in the UK, Ireland, and the EU writ large, which is, in general, you look at the master's degrees in the UK, they're going to be more theoretical. They're going to expect more independence than in the US, right? So by the time you finished an undergrad degree in the UK, frequently you're working at the level of someone who's ended their grad coursework in the UK. So those master's degrees, it is a bit of a cultural adaptation. If you talk to the folks who have already done it, there's nobody coming in and saying you're going to go to these lectures or you're going to rotate through these labs and do this. And it's not a continuous assessment model. You might, it sort of go off and do your thing and let me know when you've got some results if you're a scientist, or go off, do your reading and let me know where you've got a draft of the paper if you're in the humanities and social sciences. And some Americans find the very hands-off tuition in the UK quite a shock to the system, they all come around to loving it, because ultimately it means you get to do self-driven work. And Mark Hersom always, who's a material scientist that I know Paul knows, who did a degree in the UK, always talks about, yeah, everybody's doing their own thing. They're taking lots of breaks for tea. They're going for drinks in the pub afterwards. They're spending fewer hours in the lab, but everybody's doing a lot less busy work and a lot more sort of intensive original work from an earlier stage as a result. So that in his mind, and I certainly, and speaking from my own experience, going back into graduate tuition in the US, which is far more structured and far more like undergraduate tuition, where you've got, exams and papers and weekly assignments and so forth, comes as a shock to the system. Now, there's a slightly different frame. So you've got this sort of lean towards the theoretical when you're in the UK. There is a slight lean towards the applied, and these are broad stroke caricatures, right? So nobody take this with too great a level of specificity. But as you're looking at programs, so if you're looking in some of the programs in Ireland or at those Erasmus Mundus, they will look really applied. When you're talking about wine tourism, that's pretty bloody applied. And they, as part of that, will teach you soil chemistry and tax law. Not that I've looked at it or anything, but it has a very specific outcome. And some of the degree programs, likewise in Ireland, particularly if you look at places like Dublin City University and so forth, they will have sort of very concrete, if you will, professionalized outcomes. This is not across the board. Sometimes it's really about the origins of the university, whether the university evolved out of what was the equivalent of a polytechnic or they call them polytechnics in the UK as well. And you can find those too at places like London City University, where they're more applied. But with the Erasmus Mundus, you'll get them that are quite narrow and quite applied. Some of the times this is what appeals with the Irish universities. So you get them that are post-conflict societies, and they really are talking about the application of working with specific populations. I've seen some of those in the higher ed realm as well, in Ireland. So that's just getting a handle for what the mentality of the course is. It's going to vary more between courses than it is going to whether or not you're on one side or the other of the English Channel. But that's just something that I also advise folks to keep in mind when they're looking at international degree programs, is what that structure is and how they're going to be taught and what they're going to ask of you. And if they have weird nomenclature, then I'm always happy to parse it. I never mind getting the email which says, this one says it's a taught course, but then it says it has a thesis. What on earth? And it's like, yes, they'll call it a taught course, even though it has a thesis, because you're not just doing research. They only call it a research course if all you're doing all year is one research project. And in particular, in the UK, there are master's degrees that exist that are just one long research project all year.
So I just want to clarify something. When you were talking about, you talk about finding a mentor first, and that even the Fulbrights, right? So if like I was looking at the Institute of Education in London and I wanted to do master's in school administration, then I would find a mentor in that subject area. Correct. Okay.
So this is the looking at the school administration one, and again, always feel free to like send me the particular degree link if you're not sure what I've described applies to a particular degree. But typically there will still be either a project or a thesis at the end of that degree. And so you really want to think about who do you want to have as your mentor in that. And for those of you who are thinking about returning to the US for further study, whether JD, MD, PhD, any number of other things, it is typically that person who's really going to end up being your letter writer and your mentor moving forward. So consider it to be the beginning of a beautiful lifelong relationship, in terms of if you've started with that person, then your ability to maybe do some work with them earlier in the year and really develop that strong mentorship with them over the course of time is going to be greater. So I'm working right now with some students who are committed to going to the UK next year and are thinking about, well, how would they apply for PhDs after they finish, after they finish those programs. And so, one of the things is, if you can find a way, if you're going to apply while you're in the UK, then if you can work with someone that's really close, that you think is a potential long-term mentor starting in the first term, so that they're already able to get to know you a little bit and perhaps write for you for grad school if you're applying, then great. If you think you're going to wait and apply after you've completed the degree, or in some cases, if it's a Marshall or a Rhodes and you're doing a 2-year degree, if you're not applying until the second year, then you definitely have had more time to develop those mentorship relationships. But I do have I have a little mantra that whenever you're assembling letters of rec, no matter for what, you want those letters, whether it's 1 letter or 8 letters, to cover the depth of your expertise, the breadth of your interests, and how you've changed over time. And so you're always going to want a letter from Northwestern, from your undergraduate institution, to sort of speak to how your interests have evolved. And then if you end up having a really fabulous experience in an international destination, maybe you take 2 letters from that program when you apply to grad school if they want 3, but you're always going to want at least 1 letter per degree program to sort of speak to what you were doing and the depth you developed at that point. So the more you investigate the mentors there, the more you can think strategically about your long-term goals and how that program's going to build in, both in terms of writing the application and in terms of thinking about just the practicalities of how you want to move on, from that position.
Sort of going off of that just real quick, if I'm considering applying to grad school like this, for most of these I can defer because I'm really only looking at the 1-year programs. And
I remember, yeah.
But I can, is it still is there any program where you sort of can't really, or has there ever been any problems with sort of deferring like a graduate school acceptance, one of these scholarships, or is that not really usually?
I remember once we had a Fulbrighter who was admitted to a doctoral program in philosophy that they hemmed and hawed a bit, and then it turned out sort of the worst case scenario was if they were to tell you, oh, reapply. But I will say in recent memory, it's all been deferred. Like we had a material scientist who deferred her doctoral program at Stanford to do a 1-year Marshall. I've worked with students where Yale Law deferred 3 years for them to do the PhD in Oxford. And I've also worked with somebody who was in the Harvard has this 2+2 program, but they gave her extension so she could do her PhD at Oxford and get her Teach for America done, and blah, blah, blah. So for the most part, they're going to allow you to do that. I cannot promise in all cases. Do not take this in any way as a promise in all cases. However, I have seen happy outcomes. I know one of the reasons the Marshall started allowing it is because you get a lot of kids from military academies who apply for these opportunities, and they were concerned about how their deployments would work and so forth, and it was kind of built around that one. The bigger issue is if you don't have that, right? They want you to stay for 2 years and to be part of the community for longer if possible. So for folks who are like, well, I think I'd only really like to commit 1 year to that, because I've had folks who was like, oh, but I'd like to be able to, a classic one didn't, yeah, none of them were happy with how the election turned out, but it was like they wanted to be around in 2016 to work on the election. But that kind of more amorphous thing that I think there's this thing I might want to do, so I would only want to spend 1 year, that's generally not going to fly. But if it's, I've been admitted to med school and I wanted to, I'm going to defer it, I've been admitted to law school, defer it, I've been admitted, or I'm in the application process for doctoral program, that's the sort of place where Marshall will let you make the argument down to 1. Now, you're still reducing your chances, right? Because they're only giving 8 of those, and they're giving, now, at least the last 2 years where money was good, they were giving over 40 total. My guess is back in the bad old days after 2008, they went down to giving 30, and then they got more money and went up again. We'll see what happens, but nonetheless, it's always a smaller fraction that gets the 1 year. So something to keep in mind based on where you are in your application cycle. So, all right. Well, and then Caroline, just since I was talking about who gets nominated for what and at when, just a note that since you were at Northwestern as an undergrad, though you're doing the master's now with Marshall and Rhodes, and if you woke up tomorrow and you really wanted to go to Asia, there's something called the Loose that Amy works on. For those, you're nominated still through your undergraduate institution. Even, and same thing for you, Jens, even when you are an alum, but with Mitchell, they do not let us, I mean, it strips us of the ability to write an institutional letter of nomination. So this is the message I want to get across for that, is if you're applying for Mitchell as an alum, then I definitely want to talk to you about how to think about your letter writers to figure out who could frame what I would normally have the pleasure of putting in an institutional nomination in terms of the framing of your match with Northwestern and what that lends you as a representative. Then I've talked to our alumni who applied, sort of thinking about which of their letter writers could potentially that role, so that you can have that conversation with them about the fact that there won't be the sort of institutional cover that I would normally write to accompany your application. All right, it is 5:03. I want to just make sure again, you guys are all right with my sending this out, because your faces and names will be on it. Caroline, you're sure? Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. And do not hesitate to, get back in touch with more individual questions, or if you try to find, one of these websites and you're not getting to it, let me know and I'll send it out again.
Speaking of which, real quick,
Sure.
the interactive map, I'm
Yes.
signed into my Northwestern email on Chrome, and it says you do not have access to Google My Maps. Please contact your organization administrator for access.
It blocked me as well when I tried to get
Oh,
on.
great. But it didn't block me, which is just bizarre.
Maybe I have to be on the VPN.
We could
Oh,
try
I
to
am on VPN.
I can try to set it on the
Let me raise it. So Jason Roberts, who some of you know, is the person who interfaces with global media on our website, and I will tell him that folks were having trouble getting into it, because I certainly don't have any idea why that would be the case, but I am on VPN, so I have technically logged into the university, I suppose, when I've gotten on it.
That might be it.
All right. Well,
One quick, sorry, last question.
sure.
For the Fulbright, because I'm also considering doing the Fulbright for Manchester, should I sort of go through, like, should I let Steve Hill know that as well?
Yes.
Or because it's okay, so.
Yeah, you should.
Also be-
He will ask for, and let me give a pitch for particularly why earlier is better. So once you've decided where you want to go and why you want to go to that place, and you file the registration form with Steve, then he can give you a Fulbright faculty advisor. And the earlier you do that, the more likely he's able to sort of be picky about, oh, it'd be really interesting to put Paul with, this faculty member who's in McCormick and might have an interesting perspective on his application. Whereas if you wait and you're doing that in the middle of the summer, then it's basically who's free, and that person we hope will do their best. And it's always about getting an outside reader because you've got your own mentors to do the technical specialty. But it's just the earlier you do it, the more latitude he has in who he can match you up with. And it's nice when when that really becomes another strong mentor for you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, folks, I am going to end this meeting, see whether I can deal with the whole video and chat harvesting, and I will inquire of Jason about the website, but I doubt that's going to get answered till Monday. So don't hesitate to send me a ping on Monday and remind me. Thanks a lot, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
Good weekend.